My son shouted. You live in this hole because you're a beggar. But he didn't recognize the woman sitting beside the governor was me. She lives in that hole 'cause she's a beggar. That's what my own son shouted, right in the middle of my grandson's birthday party, in front of dozens of people. I just stood there, still holding a paper plate I hadn't even touched, just looking at him. And in that moment I knew I was no longer a mother in his eyes. I once sold my house to save him from bankruptcy. I took care of both of his kids while his wife was in the hospital. But just one sentence. That's all it took to erase me. Not because it hurt, but because from that second on I understood. It was time I started living for myself. My name is Martha Mayhew. I'm 74 years old, widowed for 20. I used to be a librarian at the Sparrow Creek City Library, right here in Montana. If you've ever thought a woman my age should just sit quietly, sip her tea, knit some scarves and wait for the grandkids to visit, then I'd ask you to just pause for a few minutes and listen to my story. I'm not here to complain. I'm not looking for any sympathy. I just want to share something. Something that might wake someone else up out there before they lose themselves the way I once did. Because some wounds you can't see, but they quietly eat away at your dignity, bit by bit, piece by piece. And then one day when you're treated like you're invisible, you'll understand why I walked away from that hole. And for me that day was my grandson's birthday. A day that should have brought our family together. But instead it was the day my son exposed me in front of everyone. They say a grandchild's birthday is a time for family to come together. But I never imagined it would be the day my own son would humiliate me in front of everyone. The aluminum tray in my hands was still warm as I stepped across the damp grass and placed it on the long table that was set up in their backyard. Inside was a dish of my scalloped potatoes. I'd gotten up at 5 in the morning just to make it. I looked around. The smell of barbecue was mixing with the scent of the dry autumn leaves. Some old country music was humming from a little green speaker. Songs I used to hear back when I worked at the Sparrow Creek Library. But somehow everything felt distant today. Sarah didn't even meet my eyes when she said, "Mama Martha, you just take a seat and relax. We've got it from here." Her voice was as sweet as molasses, almost flawless, but her eyes never invited me to join the table. There was no seat for me. No one called me over to the circle of laughter by the beer cooler. I quietly sat down on a wooden chair over by the fence. No one was using it. No one had even noticed how weathered and forgotten it was. Lily and Jack were running around with their birthday balloons. My son Mark stood by the grill in a tight polo shirt, a beer can in his hand, laughing as he told stories to a group of his friends. I recognized a few of the faces from his high school days. They used to eat dinner in my little red brick house back when Mark would bring them over for their study groups. Now not a single one of them looked my way. Not one word. Not even a hello. I used to live in that red brick house over on Elm Street, the one with the big maple tree that would shed its golden leaves each fall. I sold it, moved into a trailer by the edge of the woods, just to save Mark from bankruptcy so he could have a fresh start. I still remember what he said when he signed the papers. "You're the only one who believes in me, Mama. I won't ever forget this." I believed him blindly. Sarah came back and handed me a can of soda, already opened. "Your favorite," she said. Then she turned away before I could even say thank you. I took a sip. It was flat. The sky had turned a dull gray. The autumn clouds were stretched across the sky like the deep wrinkles on my own forehead. Beer cans were being popped open one after another. They all started eating. Charred burgers were passed out from the tray. Hot potatoes. Soda was poured from a cooler. No one asked if I was hungry. I just sat there, listening to the laughter that rose up behind me, feeling like the very wall they were all leaning on. I looked over at Mark. He was saying something, laughing loud. I couldn't hear the words, but I remembered everything. The nights I'd rocked him through his fevers. The times I'd shielded him from the bullies at school. The tears I'd swallowed when he chose Sarah over finishing his schooling. I remembered every single little thing. But now he seemed to remember none of it. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the table. I picked up a paper plate, took the smallest burger and a few slices of cucumber. I was just about to turn back when Mark looked over, squinted and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mama, you still haven't given me back that credit card I borrowed last month." I froze. At first, I didn't understand why he would bring that up. And then I did. People were watching. The beer cans were paused midair. Sarah's eyes flicked over to me, then quickly away, like I was a stain on her pretty white dress. I lowered my voice, trying to stay calm. I just wanted to remind you there were a few charges on it. Thought maybe it would be safer to just lock the card for now. Mark scoffed. So now you think I'm stealing from you? His voice got louder, clearer. You live in that broken down trailer 'cause you chose to. No one forced you. And now you're asking for a few bucks back from some credit card? You live in that hole 'cause you're a beggar. You get that, Mama? Silence. The entire backyard fell completely quiet. I stood there, still holding that flimsy paper plate. The burger slipped off and hit the ground. I didn't even notice. I caught the eyes of a stranger, one of Mark's friends. He looked down immediately. A woman let out an awkward little laugh and made an excuse to go refill her drink. Only Sarah stayed composed. She glanced at me again, the same way the library managers used to glance at the janitors who would mop too close to closing time. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I simply turned around and walked out of that yard across the grass. The wind slipped through my collar. The country music was still playing behind me, those cheerful tunes that now felt like a cruel joke. No one called me back. Not a single voice. Back at the trailer, I opened the creaky wooden door and turned on the light. A soft, yellow glow spilled over the old carpet and the armchair where I used to sit and knit. A squirrel darted past the window. I stood in the middle of my small room and just looked around. A crooked black and white wedding photo on the wall. A few baby pictures of Lily and Jack, clinging to the mini-fridge with some tired old magnets. I stepped closer. Not out of anger, but because I realized that I'd vanished from those pictures a long time ago. I just hadn't noticed it. I opened the bottom drawer beneath the sink. Inside was an old wooden box. The corners were worn, and the metal latch had rusted. It held the things no one had asked about in 20 years. Photos, handwritten letters, little keepsakes. The only things I had taken with me after selling the red brick house on Walnut Hill back in 2015. I told Mark I was fine with moving to the trailer. I'd said I'd be happy as long as they could get through their financial storm. Back then, Sarah had just given birth to the twins. Mark had lost his job. Their student loans were just strangling them. I gently pulled out the photos, which were all wrapped up in some old newspaper. I did it quietly, like someone who was burying herself. A picture of me holding baby Mark back when I was 30. My hair was thick then, and my eyes were full of hope. Another one from his high school graduation. Me holding a bouquet of flowers. Him smiling shyly. Thanksgiving photos from when Sarah first joined the family. I was the one who cooked the turkey, made the cranberry sauce from scratch, set the table. I used to believe that if I just loved hard enough, our family would stay whole. But love, when it's unacknowledged, is just another form of self-neglect. I thought of Sarah's eyes from earlier. Not hateful, just indifferent. The look of someone who knows they hold all the power and doesn't even need to say it out loud. Maybe to her, I no longer had anything worth respecting. No house, no pension, no role beyond just babysitting and being a burden. I flipped open an old letter Mark had written back in 2007, when he was in business school up in Pittsburgh. Mama, thank you for paying my tuition. I promise I won't let you down. I'd kept that letter for 16 years. Now reading it again, those promises just felt like dust. It was dark now. I made a cup of tea, poured it into a chipped mug, and turned on the radio. An old jazz song came on, a soft, aching saxophone. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, making the whole trailer shiver gently. I just sat there by my little wooden table, watching the boxed-up photos, a life that had been wrapped in silence. But I had hit rock bottom. And the thing about rock bottom is that it's the only place that's solid enough to push yourself up from. That's when I realized that silence isn't the end. It's the beginning of something else. Quieter but stronger. Because once you've touched the bottom, it's the one place you can push from to rise up again. And that very night I decided I would push back, and I'd push back hard. At dawn the next morning, before the sun had even risen, I left the trailer. No one saw me go. No one knew where I was headed. I left the trailer before dawn. No goodbyes. No one knew where I was going. The early wind stung my face, carrying the scent of dry pine and dust. The fabric bag on my shoulder rustled softly with every step as I walked the dirt path that led to the Sparrow Creek bus stop. I didn't bring much. Just a few changes of clothes, some cash, a small box of old photographs, and one single card from 1989. Its color had faded to a pale yellow. It was printed with the emblem of a volunteer program I had joined when I was young. It was the last thing that made me feel like I had once been useful beyond just being a mother. Sparrow Creek at 5:30 in the morning was deserted. The bus stop looked forgotten. A warped metal bench, a flickering schedule screen. I sat down, my back aching from another sleepless night. The sky was still dark, but I could feel a pale blue-gray slowly seeping across the horizon. A delivery truck rumbled past, its wheels squeaking, leaving a faint trail of dust behind. I pulled out the newspaper I'd stuffed into my coat pocket, the only one I had picked up from the corner store the night before. The headline was about rising interest rates and housing issues on the east side. I didn't care about those lines anymore. What I was looking for was some silence in my own mind, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to believe there was still something ahead of me. I boarded bus number 7, heading downtown toward the city library, the place where I had worked for nearly 2 decades, where the scent of old books and paper dust always made me feel real. I took my old seat by the west window, a worn magazine in my hand. My fingers were trembling as I flipped the pages, until I stopped at a photo of a church charity event at Trinity. I used to serve porridge there every single weekend. I squinted at a curly-haired woman in the corner of the photo. I thought, that was you. I looked up, startled. Standing before me was a woman in her 50s, with shoulder-length curls, wearing a plum-colored knit coat, and holding a thick folder. I'm Darla. Darla Mitchell. You used to serve soup down at Trinity, didn't you? I blinked and then I nodded. You remember? You showed me how to fold the lid just right so the soup would stay hot. She smiled, and her smile didn't feel intrusive. It felt warm and genuine. I closed the magazine. So you remember that? Not just remember. She pulled out a chair across from me. I manage a foundation, the Carlin Trust. We're expanding a new project for our seniors, and I thought, maybe you'd be interested. I looked at her, cautious and skeptical. But her eyes, there was no agenda there. We're hiring community advisors. People who've truly lived. People who know what it feels like to be forgotten, and who understand what it takes to make someone feel like they still matter. She paused. I don't need a specialist. I need you, Miss Martha. I didn't answer right away, but inside something just cracked. Just a thin little fracture in the ice I'd buried myself under for nearly a decade. Darla called over a social worker to fill out a simple form, and then she drove me in her silver SUV. Along the way, she told me about Carlin Reserve, a renovated cluster of cottages for single seniors, with community rooms, an outdoor chess patio, open libraries, and a shared kitchen. It's not a nursing home, she emphasized. It's a place where people who thought they were forgotten get to feel useful again. I held my fabric bag tightly in my lap. Every curve in the road brought back a piece of my life. The years I'd worked at the library. The days Mark had learned to read, and I taught him how to use the Dewey Decimal System. The nights I'd rubbed Sarah's back during her pregnancy while Mark was working graveyard shifts. Carlin Reserve came into view just before noon. Wooden cottages with sloped roofs, leaves scattered across their porches. A chessboard table sat in the front yard. An old man was hunched over the paper, not noticing anyone. Darla stepped out first and waved me over. The corner one's yours. It's a 30-day trial. If it's not the right fit, you can move on. No strings attached. I stepped into the little wooden cottage. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air. A smell like a memory. There was a small dining table with a rust-red tablecloth, a cushioned chair by the window, a stone fireplace. On the table sat a mug of black coffee. No sugar. No one had to say it, but I knew someone had told them what I liked. I hung up my coat, set my bag down, washed my face, and then I sat in the armchair. The afternoon sunlight was slanting through the window, falling across a knit throw, one that looked just like the ones I used to make. Not the same, but identical in spirit. I closed my eyes. I wasn't dead. I was just in hibernation. And when spring comes, they'll see that I'm no longer just a shadow. I once thought I was a stain on Mark's life. But then one letter from the past reminded me of who I used to be. Some mornings when the mist still blanketed the grass at Carlin Reserve, I would just sit in the little kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, staring out the window. The world was still then, with only the rustling of the dry leaves and the faint footsteps of Mr. Hemlock, walking his morning laps around the chess patio. In those early days I didn't say much. I just did things. I'd clean the kitchen, wash the tablecloths, and sit quietly in the little library, reading old periodicals. No one asked me to. I didn't need any praise. Darla was the first one to notice. One Thursday morning, as I was placing some large books up on a shelf, she walked in and said as softly as a breath, "Miss Martha, I want you to think about a community idea. Not because you owe anyone anything, but because someone out there needs your light." That sentence just brought me back to 1989. There was a time when I had led others, not because of any title or power, but because I had believed in something that was bigger than myself. A photo of me with Mr. Herbert Carlin during our volunteer days now hung quietly in the Carlin Trust office. A silent testament to that very belief. I began talking to those around me. Mr. Hemlock shared stories of his time in Germany, driving tanks, losing 2 of his brothers to the war. Agnes, an elderly woman, had broken her hip last year. She now knitted scarves just to keep her hands from going numb with loneliness. They didn't need any lectures. They just needed someone to sit beside them, gently touch their hand and say, "Me too." And so the Winter Foods for Seniors program was born. I didn't have any social media. I wasn't good at planning. But I had my feet and I had a name. I went to the local grocery store, which was run by the son of my old high school classmate, and I asked for donations of noodles, rice, and powdered milk. I called a woman who used to attend my knitting classes at the community center and asked if she could help me pack some care kits. She just laughed and said, "It's been ages since someone asked me to do something that actually mattered." One afternoon, with the golden leaves falling like rain, I returned to the center, carrying a fabric bag that was full of donation sign-up sheets. Darla was waiting at the door with a pale yellow envelope. She didn't say anything, she just handed it to me. Inside was a handwritten letter, yellowed with age, in a slanted script. "Martha is the only person I trust to preserve the true meaning of service." It was from Herbert Carlin. I don't remember how long I just sat there on the porch. But my eyes were wet and my heart, after years of weariness, began to beat again, to the rhythm of an old belief. After that, I stopped shying away when someone would ask for my thoughts. I began to suggest ideas. Instead of simply distributing the donated goods, I proposed a winter warmth market, a place where the recipients could choose what they needed: a scarf, a jar of apple jam, or a bag of black beans. Ruth, a widow who usually sat in silence during our knitting classes, volunteered to create some colorful signs for each of the stalls. When I asked her why, she said, "I used to be a kindergarten teacher, but after my husband died, I just thought all my energy was gone. Today I realized it was just asleep." People started looking at me differently. Not with pity, like on that first day, and not with judgment, like at Mark's party, but with the eyes of those who had also touched rock bottom, who had been blown off course by life's winds, and then had seen a steady hand reaching out, quietly, without any judgment. The winter market took place in early November. The air was chilly, the sunlight filtering through the golden trees. In the center of the yard, some makeshift stalls had been built from wooden frames and old cloth. There were no fireworks, no booming music, just some quiet chatter, some soft daytime laughter, and the wind brushing through our wool sleeves. I, Martha, was standing at the jam stall. I was showing a fellow elder how to seal a jar to keep the glass intact, and how to write the labels in a bold, black ink for our aging eyes. Someone leaned in and said, "You remind me of my mother. She's gone now." I didn't know what to say. I just rested my hand on their shoulder, and held a silence that was long enough to let them know that I understood. Then the local paper arrived. They took some pictures, jotted down some notes, and asked a few questions. At first I stepped back, wanting Darla to take the center stage, but she just pulled me forward and said, "Miss Martha keeps this place in rhythm. No one else." That evening, after we had cleaned up, I returned to my room, my small wooden space with a window that faced the lake. I took off my moss green cardigan, hung it on the old hook by the door, and I sat on the bed, my fingers brushing the half-knit scarf. My own mother used to say, "People never truly break. We just grow moss. And sometimes all it takes is a gentle hand to wipe it away, and the stone underneath will show itself again." I realized I didn't need to become who I was before. I just needed to remember who I had been, and that I could still be her in a new way. The next day, as I was dropping off the new project proposal at the Carlin Trust office, I noticed something strange. On the left wall, near the receptionist's desk, where some old certificates used to hang, there was now a large, newly framed photo. I paused. My heart just dipped, and then it rose again with a feeling I couldn't quite name. In the photo was a line of volunteers standing behind a kitchen counter back in 1989. My hands were covered in flour, and my hair was tied back with a rubber band. And beside me, smiling wearily but warmly, stood Herbert Carlin. I'd forgotten that photo had ever even existed, but here it was hanging like a milestone. Darla appeared with a paper coffee cup in her hand, her eyes softer than usual. I found it in the archives while I was organizing the storage room. Herbert kept so many letters, photos, and notes. I thought you should see this one. She handed me a cream-colored envelope with a soft gold trim. Herbert's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted slightly to the left with gentle strokes. I sat down by the window, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single page. The words were plain, honest, just like him. If I am no longer here, please give this letter to Martha Mayhew. I have worked with many people in my life, but Martha is the only one I trust to carry the true spirit of service. She doesn't just give. She gives with dignity and a deep understanding. Let her lead, even if it's only a small group. I folded the letter and held it in my lap. Outside, the sunlight was spilling through the leaves. I closed my eyes. I once thought I was just a shadow. No name, no trace. But someone had remembered. Someone had seen me, even though I had never stood on a stage, worn a badge, or held a title. That night, in my little wooden room, I turned on the desk lamp. Its soft yellow light spread across the table and the wall. I pulled out a new notebook, not for a diary, but for some plans for the Carlin Fund Christmas Gala. I didn't want it to be just another fundraiser. I wanted it to be something people would remember. Not for the pies or the decorations, but for the way we had touched each other with truth and trust. I'd never studied management, but I knew how to listen. How to seal a jar tight enough to survive the winter. How to walk away even if no one said goodbye. And now I knew something more. I wasn't moss. I was stone. When I returned to my little desk to fold the scarf, I noticed something resting quietly on the wooden surface. A thick red card with embossed snowflake patterns. I opened it. It was an official invitation. Carlin Fund Christmas Gala, December 22nd. I smiled. Darkness isn't the enemy. It's just the canvas for the light. And then the night of the Christmas Gala arrived. The night I was finally ready to stop being a shadow. Mark looked up, his wine glass frozen mid-sip. His daughter pointed and asked, "Dad, why is Grandma sitting with the governor?" I heard the question clearly from the far end of the ballroom, where the crystal lights were spilling over the long table that was draped in a white linen cloth, as the murmur of voices swelled around us. Heads were turning and curious eyes were scanning my face, comparing it to some distant memory, trying to match it with the silver-haired woman who was walking calmly in a gray satin dress. The dress wasn't a designer one. It was rented, but it fit so perfectly, it felt as if it had been made just for me. I had chosen gray because it made me feel balanced. Like I didn't have to shout to be seen, or shrink to stay invisible. I could just stand naturally as myself. I walked beside Darla, her arm gently linked with mine in a quiet respect. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. Each step was a reminder. Every step matters. I didn't scan the room. I didn't need to. I just looked ahead, toward the tall Christmas tree that was glowing gently near the stage. But I knew my son was there. Of course I did. Both Mark and Sarah were guests of a bank that was sponsoring the gala. They had no idea I would be attending, let alone being honored. I heard Sarah gasp, "Oh my God, is that Mrs. Martha?" Her voice wasn't quiet enough to go unnoticed. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could just feel the discomfort rolling off their table like cigarette smoke curling through a sealed room. From the main stage, the microphone crackled to life. The governor of Montana, who had once ridden the bus with me during his college days, smiled as he approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we gather not only to celebrate Christmas, but to honor someone who has quietly rebuilt the spirit of the Carlin Trust at a time when kindness is so often underestimated. No one deserves it more than Mrs. Martha Mayhew, who has not only given her life to others but has reignited the very soul of this community. Applause followed. Not the polite automatic clapping but the kind that has a heartbeat. The kind that means something. I stood, no shoulders raised, no head bowed, just a quiet smile. A reporter came over for a few words. I just nodded and kept it short. Darla took care of everything else. I let her. And then I heard the patter of small feet. Grandma! Lily and Jack, and right behind them, they threw their arms around me, their little cheeks pressed into the folds of my dress. Jack's tiny hand was clutching my hem, his eyes wide. Grandma, you look like a fairy. I knelt down and held them tight. The scent of kids' shampoo was still clinging to their hair. There was no distance in those hugs. Just warmth and a simple truth. They were still my grandchildren no matter what the grown-ups thought. I led them back to our table along the rows of crisp white linens. My place was near the stage, right beside the board members of the Carlin Fund. My seat had a name card embossed in gold. Martha Mayhew, Guest of Honor. Lily pointed. Grandma, your name is on the table. I nodded, smoothing her hair, just like I had nodded to myself 3 months ago when I was still packing up my photo boxes in a cold, dark trailer. Darla leaned in and whispered, I told you. You're the heart of this winter. And probably many more to come. We sat down as the first course arrived. A butternut squash soup with some nutmeg, steaming and fragrant. I wasn't hungry, but I lifted the spoon anyway, as a way to keep myself in rhythm with the world again. My eyes found Mark across the room. His face was stiff, frozen like bronze, his hand still resting on the glass he hadn't yet lifted. Sarah leaned in and whispered something to him, but her gaze darted away when she saw mine. I didn't look away. I didn't accuse. I just looked. Not with anger. I wasn't here for any revenge. I was here because I deserved to be. A major donor approached, shook my hand, and said he'd read the article about Mrs. Mayhew, the woman who rebuilt a community with just a few jars of jam. I just smiled and said, I simply brought a little patience and an old basket to the market. Not long after, an event staff member came to invite me to speak. I stood. My low-heeled shoes made no sound, but I knew I was walking through the gaze of hundreds. And for the first time those eyes weren't looking past me. On the stage I used no notes. I'd known for a while what I wanted to say. A few months ago, I began. I lived in a trailer at the edge of the woods. Some people thought I was a beggar. But I wasn't. I was simply someone who knew how to give. I said nothing more. I looked straight at Mark, not to accuse but to let him witness. I stepped down from the stage to applause. Not a standing ovation, just some polite hands and for the first time some recognition. After the speech I returned to my table. The gala shifted into some soft music. The guests mingled, raised their glasses, exchanged their cards. Warm hands touched my shoulder. A few words of thanks, a few nods. I'd grown so used to being a part of the blur. So this being seen, still felt a little unfamiliar. Darla laughed and handed me a fruit mocktail. Feel like dancing? She teased. I just shook my head. I just want to sit for a little while. I chose a quiet corner, beside the gift table that was all wrapped in silver foil and red bows. My old brown leather bag was sitting on my lap. A gift from my husband on our first Christmas after he had retired. I opened it and pulled out an old card from the volunteer kitchen from 1989. The edges were yellowed but the writing was still clear. Thank you, Martha. No one needs to be perfect to deserve a chance. I looked around. Mark's table now only had Sarah and the kids. Where was my son? I didn't have to wait long. Leaving the main hall to find the exit, I saw Mark standing by the door. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall, dusting his blazer's shoulders like some forgotten ash. He saw me, took one step toward me, and then he stopped. Mama! I looked him straight in the eye, the same way I had from the stage. Can you come home with us for Christmas? He asked. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because some questions just need time for the heart to find the answer on its own. I once lived in a trailer. No living room, no heat. But the coldest thing I ever felt was my own child's indifference. That's what I realized most clearly, while sitting in the shared kitchen of Carlin Reserve on Christmas night. The scent of cookies baking filled the air, blending with orange peel and ginger. At the table, Darla was helping Mrs. Hemlock hook the last of the ornaments onto the tree. Outside the window, the snow had begun to fall, light and soft, just enough to blanket the rooftops and the wooden steps. "Martha," Mr. Hemlock called from the hallway, holding a little silver and red gift box. "You accept gifts?" I smiled. "If it's cookies, yes." Mr. Hemlock chuckled but handed me the box anyway. "You open it." Inside was a small wooden flute, old but polished clean. Engraved near the mouthpiece were the words, "To one who makes music out of silence." "I found it at a flea market," he said. "I carved that line in myself. I just figured. You're that kind of person." I didn't play music. I didn't blow into it. I just held it, studying the grain. It wasn't a gift for the ears. It was one for the soul. Dinner began at 7. I was the head cook. Beef stew, cornbread, a roasted tomato salad, and a lightly spiced squash soup. But the centerpiece was the little sign in the middle of the table. "Every dish tells a story." Darla had suggested it the week before. "We're not just eating," she had said. "We're remembering." I stood up first. "I made this stew for the first time when I was 16. I began, my voice steady. "My mother told me, if you can make something that makes people go quiet while they're eating, then you've done it right." A light laughter circled the table. "I never cooked it for Mark," I continued. "Not because I was angry, but because I was afraid that if he ate it and felt nothing, I'd lose my last piece of her." No one spoke, but the eyes around the table just softened. Mr. Hemlock nodded, resting his hand on the little flute. Mrs. Hemlock held Darla's hand. And me. For the first time I felt at peace. Like a soup that's been seasoned just right. Not too much, not too little. After dinner, everyone gathered in the common room, a square space with wood-paneled walls and a high ceiling that was strung with warm lights. Mrs. Hemlock sat at the electric piano in the corner, her hands trembling but steady, playing Silent Night with the delight of a child. Others sat in a circle, cocoa in hand, some wrapped in blankets, some just listening. I sat too, wearing my moss-green cardigan, the little wooden flute still tucked in my pocket. Darla came over and sat cross-legged like a grandchild. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think Martha Mayhew was just a retired woman with a modest legacy. But it turns out you're the best part of what I still believe about kindness." I chuckled softly, then I glanced around the room, at all the people who had once been forgotten, who were now singing Christmas carols like a humble little choir. Just then Rosie, a little orphan girl who was staying with us temporarily while her mom went through rehab, ran up to me and pressed a broken cookie into my hand. "I saved the best piece for you," she said, and then she dashed off, her hair flying like a wordless thank you. I held the cookie, watching her go, and suddenly I remembered Mark at her age. He was curled up in the kitchen, crying, asking, "Mama, is Dad ever coming back?" I had no answer then. But now I had an answer for myself. Back at my cottage later that night, I found an envelope waiting on my doorstep. There was no name written on it, but I recognized the handwriting right away. Just 4 words. "Mama, I'm sorry. I understand." I didn't open it. I just placed it inside the little wooden box with the old photographs and the Christmas card from 1989. Forgiveness is something I've already made peace with on the inside. But going back to the way things were, that's no longer something I need. The next morning, Christmas Day, Carlin Reserve lay under a soft layer of snow, like powdered sugar. The little tree in the front yard was drooping from the weight of the wet snow, but its lights were still glowing. In the shared kitchen, people were up earlier than usual. Not because they had to be, but because they had something to give. Homemade gifts, warm wishes, a folded-up poem tucked inside a napkin. I sat by the window, holding a printed newspaper in my familiar mug of black coffee. The fireplace was hissing softly, filling the air with the scent of burning wood and fresh bread. Mr. Hemlock knocked, and then he stepped in, holding a weathered box that was wrapped in some old newspaper. "Merry Christmas, Martha," he said in his gravelly tone. "I think it's time you had this." I opened the box. Inside was a reddish-brown knit sweater, a V-neck, with the shoulders just a bit worn. I froze. "I kept it until I found someone who was worthy," he said. "The man who gave it to me was a buddy from the service. But I think it belongs now with someone who warms others just by being there." I didn't reply. I just folded the sweater gently, laying my hand over it like I was afraid the memories that were in its threads might just break. That afternoon, a few of the residents had gathered outside, playing chess, roasting marshmallows and swapping old stories. I didn't join them. I stayed inside, took out the little wooden flute, and I tried playing it for the very first time. The sound was off at first, wobbly, and then it steadied. Not in tune, not perfect. But I played. Not for anyone to hear, but just to remind myself that I was still alive. When evening fell, Darla stopped by with a bottle of warm spice cider. She poured me a cup. "You're not going to open the letter?" she asked, her voice soft, like she didn't want to break the stillness. I just shook my head. "I've forgiven him. But I don't live for him anymore." She didn't ask again. We just sat there in silence, watching the snow drift past the window, the flakes landing on the frosted glass and then disappearing. On Christmas night, the small wooden cottage was hushed, lit only by the warm glow of a lamp on the wall, which was illuminating an old still life painting. I sat alone, a cup of cocoa in my hand, the steam fogging up my glasses. Outside, the sky was filled with stars, and the piano in the common room was still playing faintly in the distance. "Have yourself a merry little Christmas," sounded like it was being played just for me. I looked at my reflection in the window, older, quieter, steadier. And I whispered, not for anyone else to hear, but just for me, "I'm still here. I'm still me." 3 months ago they had called me a beggar. Today my photo hangs on the city's wall of inspiration. I stood behind the red velvet curtain, waiting for my turn to step onto the stage. The Sparrow Creek City Hall hadn't hosted such a formal event for its seniors in years. There were white chair covers tied with navy blue ribbons, gleaming stone floors, and the light scent of early spring tulips in the air. Outside, the snow had melted halfway. Patches of sunburnt grass were peeking through the ground, as if winter could no longer hold back what was meant to bloom. I adjusted my coat collar and brushed back a few stray hairs. A large photograph of me and Mr. Herbert Carlin at a food drive back in 1989 had been placed prominently in the main hall. Darla said they wanted it to symbolize a resilience and a kindness that doesn't age. I simply smiled. Words like that. I've learned to receive them without shrinking. I was no longer the woman who would stand silently by the sink while her son toasted someone else with his wine. Darla stepped up beside me and gave me a slight nod. "It's your turn, Miss Martha." I walked out. The applause wasn't loud, but it was steady and genuine, as if no one had to try to show their respect. A city official handed me a certificate, with gold edges, and my name embossed right in the center. Then he passed me the microphone. I looked across the room, at the familiar faces from the craft classes, the fellow residents who had once shared chicken soup with me at the Carlin Reserve kitchen. And in the back row I saw Mark. He was sitting quietly, his head slightly bowed, his hands clenched on his knees. Lily and Jack were sitting beside him, with red hair bows and ocean blue sweaters, their eyes lifted up to me with a wonder that was both close and unfamiliar. I took a breath and I began. Some people thought I was a beggar. Some people thought I was useless, outdated, old and pitiful. And at one point I believed that too. I paused. The room fell into a silence that just swallowed every single word. But then I learned this. Old age isn't the time to disappear. It's the time to bloom in your own way. A soft murmur passed through the rows. I looked straight at my son, not in anger or blame, but simply as a mother standing tall, no longer bowed. "Thank you for letting me live through a long enough winter to understand this. Life doesn't end when others stop needing you. It begins again if you still choose to plant something new." I bowed gently. This time the applause grew. Someone stood up. Maybe they weren't clapping for an old woman. Maybe they were clapping for something inside themselves that had just woken up. After the ceremony, I walked slowly out of the hall. The wind grazed my collar, sharp enough to make me shiver but not to hurt. I was used to the cold, both the weather and the kind that comes from people. But today what I felt was a quiet kind of warmth. Darla walked beside me, silent, until we reached the main lobby. "You did it, Miss Martha," she said, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. I looked around. The same people who had once seen me as just a shadow were now nodding in greeting. Some shook my hand. Others just looked on with what might have been some guilt. But I didn't need any apologies. I didn't need any explanations. Because I knew my worth no longer depended on their eyes. Mark was standing in the hallway, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a worn leather notebook. I recognized it instantly. The one where I used to scribble little notes about my life, about teaching, about motherhood, even some old clumsy poems that no one had ever read. I didn't know when he'd found it. But when our eyes met, I knew he'd read it. Mark took a slow step forward. His face was no longer defensive or ashamed. He was just a son, seeing his mother for the very first time without the filter of his own guilt or pride. "Mama," he said, barely above a whisper. Would you come back with us this weekend? Just so the kids can be around you more?" I looked at him. A part of me wanted to embrace him, like I used to when he would fall and look up at me, just waiting to be forgiven. But the part of me that had learned to stand on her own just nodded gently. "I'll think about it, Mark," I said. Then I turned to hug Lily and Jack as they ran up to me, two bright little lights beaming up at me from the sidewalk. "Grandma, you were amazing," Lily whispered, her hair smelling of soap. "You looked like a movie hero," Jack exclaimed, his eyes just glowing. I bent down to their level. "You don't need a stage to know who you are, sweetheart. You just need a belief from the inside." They nodded like I had just told them a magic spell. Then I stood up. Mark was still standing under the barren tree, the little leather notebook in his hand. He didn't move any closer. He didn't call out. But when I glanced back, he just gave a small nod. I nodded too. Slower. Not cold, not heavy. Just enough for both of us to understand. What needed forgiving had been forgiven. What couldn't be restored, we would let it rest. That afternoon, I returned to Carlin Reserve. Darla was baking some raisin cookies. Mr. Hemlock was sitting by the window, reading the paper. I hung up my coat and made myself a mug of hot cocoa, unsweetened. Mr. Hemlock always said, "At our age, too much sweet, and you forget what life really tastes like." I settled into my familiar wicker chair, facing the large window. Outside, the January sky had cleared. The gray clouds had drifted to the edge of the horizon, leaving a soft blue like chiffon above the trees. I took a sip, rested my hand on my lap, slow and steady. And I knew. I was no fairy godmother. No miracles. No one had come to save me. I was just an old woman, once hurt, once forgotten, once called a beggar. And today I was sitting here with my name etched on a plaque of honor. Not because someone had given it to me, but because I had refused to give up on myself. They may still look at me with surprise. They may still whisper. They may feel some regret or they may not. But I no longer look for any validation in their eyes because I know who I am. I didn't disappear. I simply bloomed on the very ground they all thought I wouldn't survive on. 3 months ago I had left in silence. Empty hands and an even emptier heart. Today those same hands have sown some hope again. For those the world had nearly forgotten. I used to believe that love meant giving without any condition. But in the end I learned this. If you don't honor yourself, even your closest loved ones can turn away from you. Like an old coat that once kept the whole house warm. When the cold passes, some won't hesitate to just toss it out on the porch without a second thought. If this story reminds you of someone who once quietly gave everything for their family, you should call them. Or simply give them a hug. Because sometimes that's all it takes to keep a heart from going completely cold.